Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, to the third the live show of the Sfera Network. So, as you know, Sfera Network, this is the first consortium of young media outlets across Europe, with partners in France, Belgium, Hungary, Poland, Spain, Greece, and soon with other partners across Europe. We are doing this live today really to talk about a bit what's going to happen for the European elections, which will be scheduled next year. We thought, in the spring of 2023, as the birds are back right now, let's just take stock on what has been going on towards like young Europeans and how they're feeling like 1 year before those European elections. In a lot of ways, those European elections are going to be an historic moment. 5 years ago, before the last vote, like there was no COVID, there was no war against Ukraine, maybe climate was not as important on the agenda of many young Europeans. And it seems right now just maybe to take stock, to test a bit the water on how young Europeans are feeling. So we are going to have for this live today with policy analyst from the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, Matteo Dressler. Hi, Matteo. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. Very good, thank you.
You're welcome. So let me just maybe present a bit yourself and FEPS. So Matteo, so you are a policy analyst at FEPS, so which is a center-left think tank with links to the Socialist and Democrat group in European Parliament, and you are based in Brussels, if I'm not mistaken. And you're also German. So yes, and the reason that we wanted to talk to you today is just like FEPS last year in October released, I think, one of a very interesting report in very unique in a lot of ways, because like FEPS has commissioned a report really dedicated on the polling of European millennials and European Gen Z, so basically young Europeans, and how is they are feeling about Europe, and how is they are feeling what the EU should do, and the involvement of the young Europeans into European politics more broadly. So maybe let me just start, Matteo, is like at first, what did FEPS commission these surveys, and if you can maybe tell us a bit the backstory on why you are very interested to have the opinion of young Europeans about European issues.
Yes, for sure. So actually, this report is the third in line of kind of a project, or like a line of work we've been doing here at FEPS since around 2016, where we are serving young people. We started back in the days around 2016, especially looking at the millennial generation, which was kind of the big thing at the time. It ran under the kind of headline of Millennial Dialogue, so that's kind of the branding of the previous surveys we had. But once we realized that now also, of course, Generation Z is very much up and coming, and also getting more relevant in the political sphere, let's say, being able to vote. And so it became also more important to look into what Generation Z is thinking, what young people of that generation are thinking. But we also didn't want to quite abandon, let's say, our interest in millennials. So we made it a point to include both of these generations in this most recent survey, and also compare a little bit their thoughts, their opinions on political developments, especially on European level. So that's more or less the backstory. And this specific report, we looked particular at what young people think about European politics and policies. So what are their main priorities? Then again, we also did this reported data collection of basically that survey. So it was in December 2021. So still very much against the background of the pandemic. So this also dominated how we asked some of the questions around mental health, for example. And it didn't yet include kind of also changing opinions which may have happened after the war, which was started by Russia against Ukraine in April 2022. We also commissioned a report which kind of paid respect to that, kind of trying to update some of our findings. I can hold it here in the camera if you wish. So we also have this report where we kind of looked a little bit more specific on what young people think about Ukraine and the developments there with the war. I think this is a bit the backstory of the report.
And just for audiences, like I know, like polling maybe young Europeans in the 27 countries might be a bit difficult, and let's face it, maybe a bit too expensive for foundations. Just from your side, what kind of countries maybe like did you focus on for this report?
Right. So the scope of the report is very much, like I said, it's the two generations. So that covers from people from at the time of the survey 16 to 38. When it comes to the countries, we elected to go with 12 of them. I'm not going to list them all, but there were 10 member states where we tried to achieve a spread between the north, the south, the east, the west. And then we had two non-member states, but also still in Europe, which namely the UK and Switzerland, to also get a little bit of contrast on what young people are thinking there. And in total, we collected with the two survey waves, so the one more focused on Ukraine and the other one more focused on the general picture, let's say. In total, we had around 19,000 survey responses. So each time we went into a country to ask questions, we tried to achieve 1,000 responses, which like in research terms is considered quite a good number to be also able to say something specific about the country, not only about the kind of broad European image.
Okay, super. And if we had to sum up your findings in like one or two key trends, like what for you would be like the most key points that we should remember, like 1 year before the elections, on how those young Europeans are feeling?
Okay, let's see if I can do, like, as a policy analyst. Usually I try to be to the point, but of course in 2 points it's very hard to do. But maybe a couple of points.
It can be three. It can be 3 points in case you need.
It can be three points. Okay, then maybe let me start with that, which kind of inspired also the title of this project, of that report, which is Builders of Progress, and that was the question which we asked on if people thought that young people should be more involved and empowered on EU scale and in public affairs, which was answered around 67% of young people said yes, that should happen. So kind of reflecting this sentiment of young people really want to be involved more. So whatever kind of findings came afterwards on policy priorities, we always have to see them against the background of people are not apolitical, whatever some articles, also in some media articles sometimes say, it's not that, they want to be involved. Then maybe a second point is that some of the main concerns as well as policy priorities for young people, they often revolve around, or the main one is often jobs and employment, and that's often followed by inequality and poverty. So to kind of tackle these issues, and that young people also in their personal life are concerned about it, and that's often closely followed by the issue of anything to do with the climate crisis. So it's often those three things, like it's the jobs, it's the inequality, and it's climate. So these are often the three things, and I guess I leave it at that for the main points. Oh, now I lost your sound, Quentin.
Sorry, my bad. We are in Paris. Internet connection in Paris is not always super ideal. Sorry for that. One of the questions we were very interested when we read your report is also you're asking questions that basically like not a lot of pollsters and so on are asking at the European level. Like often, like we ask what the EU should do, how Europeans are feeling, but sometimes we don't really go into like policies or issues that the EU do not really tackle as such. And you had, for example, like several points into your survey about the mental health of young Europeans. And I was wondering, like, if you can maybe explain to us, like, why did you ask those kind of questions, and did you find any like interesting points like across borders on the mental health of young Europeans, which is a question which I think it was the first time it was asked actually for us from when we did a bit of a benchmark on what was going on.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there's also been other polling institutes, maybe not Eurobarometer, but there's been others being interested in that question increasingly, and that I think with the same reasons as our motivations behind it. And it's of course the survey being put into the field just kind of, well, not at the end of the pandemic, but at least at the worst period had passed, and it was well known that that will have an impact on mental health. And how we also design kind of the study is that we, before actually putting the survey into the field and asking many people, we also had kind of interviews, focus groups with young people in a total of 4 countries. And out of those conversations, it became very clear that mental health is an issue, which made us put these questions also in the broader kind of survey to ask more people if that is actually an issue. And indeed, it is among some of the main concerns, especially on personal levels. So we asked a question like, what are your main personal concerns at this very moment? And mental health came in second there. And also another question we asked is, for example, do you think that the pandemic has negatively affected your mental well-being? Did you incur any mental health issues during the pandemic? And in fact, 61% of youngsters answered that that is a problem for them, that they had issues with it. What's interesting, or maybe slightly worrying, is that we also wanted to know how young people cope with that issue. And that we found that only about 10% had actually visited mental health professionals to deal with some of the issues. That's specifically worrying because quite a big group of those who said they have mental health problems also said that they had quite serious ones. So there's that disconnect, which of course, there's many explanations or possible explanations why that is. Like a lacking availability, for example, of mental health service. There was a big disconnect of who went to actually see mental health professionals. Those with lower education and lower income went much less than those with higher income. So there's all of that, right? And when it comes to, I think your second question was also about inequalities, housing, etc.
Yeah.
Why we included those things? Well, first of all, these things are relevant. Of course, we know that from previous studies. And then second of all, also of how you introduce me, myself, it's like we are a social democratic think tank. So we are, of course, also very much interested in inequalities that exist in society to understand them better, also in a young generation, because this understanding them better will help us also, of course, tackle these issues in a more targeted way. And this is also why we included all these questions on, for example, minimum income, on decent housing, on supporting children in need, and many more social policies to understand a little bit the range of support among young people on these matters. And we saw that there's a lot of support for the EU to take on these things. Often that's in the range of 65 to 70% of young people saying the EU should be doing more on these things.
Yeah, this is one of the very striking thing, like also on housing, because like housing is definitely something the EU should do. Like the EU is doing at the moment, sorry. Like it's not in the EU treaties, like it's often often it's very local issue. So it is at the city council issue, or maybe like a very localized issue. So besides, the polling, like, does it mean, already for the European elections, like we should expect from progressive parties or progressive institutions to really advocate for the EU to coordinate more on housing matters, or maybe to have an input on those policies in those areas?
Well, I think, yes, of course. I think it is very relevant to address the issue of housing more broadly, and then without going into kind of the nitty gritty of, yes, you're right, like some competencies are on EU level, some are much more national level, and especially when it comes to housing. But one thing about that question is we also said decent housing, and as you might be aware, just recently there was also some legislation passed on kind of making housing more energy efficient, that this will be much more of a duty, and that is indeed a European Union legislation. So things are happening on housing, also related to climate change. And I think it will be important for whoever wants to reach young people to also talk about these issues when, for example, campaigning for the election.
Cool. Good. Like another thing, like you said for the introduction of your report, is just like you also wanted to test how young Europeans like feel about like the involvement or the interaction with EU public affairs or the EU more broadly. And if I'm not mistaken, 67% of young Europeans in your survey like found like they believe the EU should do more for to involve them more into like the decision making on the EU and EU public affairs more broadly. Uh, how should we interpret this figure, which is relatively high? So does it mean like the EU is still seen as too far from European citizens? Does it mean like right now we need to create new tools to increase participation and so on? Like when you have taken a look at this number, like how we know we can interpret it?
Right. Yeah, it's not that easy. I think there's many factors. I can name one more number which will help us interpret it a bit more. So we also asked the question, do you think that your local, national, but also EU politicians should be communicating better on how the EU is influencing your daily life? So basically how decisions taken on EU level are influencing the daily life. And there, in fact, I think about 71% it was, of young people said, yes, there should be more communication around it. So to come back to your question, the communication element is for sure one of these important factors of involving young people more, kind of bringing the European Union and the decisions closer to people, because although we see also from kind of pre-election kind of polls that young people think more on European topics than they used to, like, let's say 10 years ago. They might vote more on national topics. Still, I think there's much work to do on explaining that a lot of the decisions which kind of reach the individual, the young individual, in the end, they originate, kind of the political decisions, they originate at EU level, and to make that more tangible in whatever way that could be possible. And there's, of course, many ways to do that. There is the outreach, of course, before the elections, to kind of outreach campaigns to explain better the system of the EU. There is the need for integrating in school curricula, especially more and maybe better knowledge on what the EU exactly does, where the competences are, but of course in a way that also interests young people and is not too technical, but makes it more interesting for them to see also, okay, what happens on that level is actually influencing what my life. These are some things.
Okay.
Right. And another one, which I think will be a lot also dominating the narrative when it comes to young people and elections, is of course trying to involve people also better in elections. And there is the main aspect of that's been discussed, of lowering the voting age to 16, which a couple of countries already have. And out of those, a couple have it for the European elections, others only have it for local elections. So that whole debate of kind of, because you're also affected when you're 16 and you're usually actually exposed to these kind of classes on political education at that age. So why shouldn't you also be able to vote? But then also involving young people more in around the elections, as well as election observers, as those helping like count the votes, etc. Because the earlier you're involved, the more likely you are to also feel connected to some of these things, and that might make you vote as well, and talk positively about what the EU is doing.
Yeah, like this is interesting. Like what you said. Like let me just like do a quick follow up to say like okay, it seems there was also a shift in the last 10 years about like how young Europeans were feeling about Europe, because like do you think maybe like this the fact that over 67% of Europeans really want the EU really want the EU to take more into the consideration the youth preoccupation and how they should like more involve young Europeans. Isn't it necessarily because like Europe has changed drastically like compared to in the last 10 years? Because for example, like if you are right now a young European at 20, and let's just say for example in Greece, like you were like very likely like 13, like a teenager when the Greek crisis happened and when the migration crisis happened. You were also a teenager during COVID, so you have like, so maybe like it was difficult for you to go to your Erasmus. Maybe it was difficult also for you to enjoy the EU perks and so on. And plus, like also the question of climate change, and right now I think young Europeans are more and more interested about it. So do you think also it's because the EU has changed that much in the last 10 years that right now young Europeans really want to be more involved into the process?
That's, I think, hard to answer like in a broad way. Yeah, this might be hard to say, but what we do see, because you alluded to the financial crisis as well, and the horrifying consequences that had also, especially for young people in mostly Southern Europe. I'm kind of simplifying it a little bit. And what we do see there is, for example, that also in our survey, the countries in the south of Europe and the young people in them, those are often those which are especially kind of interested in the EU taking on more of a role in social policy, providing, even working on unemployment benefits and the housing issues. So the highest amount or percentage of young people wanting the EU to step in is often in the south. So, and I guess that also comes from that experience that, they've seen that it didn't work well in the past necessarily, because the EU has also been, probably rightfully so, and many bodies related to it as well, blamed for some of the hardships and the austerity politics at around 2008 and after. However, you also see that young people want the EU to now kind of step in to kind of change something about it and make it better. So I guess that goes to your point that there is a willingness for the EU to do more.
Okay. All right. Okay. I know my next question is tricky, but it's still, like it seems from our perspective as a European media, a European network of media organization who really have a lot of young audiences, that right now it seems like it seems from anecdotal evidences that we have, it's just like people are maybe like, the generation of European millennials and Gen Z are way much more European, in the sense that right now, like, the issues are and priorities are aligning more and more across borders than maybe their predecessors. So I was wondering from your side, uh, is it backed up by your survey or by other things? And is it like a possibility, or do we still have like very strong differences on the like, for example, northern young Europeans from Northern Europe are very much different than Eastern Europeans from the same age group, or for Southern or European from the same age group? Like, are we still seeing like strong differences between those three blocks, for example, or are those differences like curbing and reducing?
Yeah. Well, since we only covered two generations, I cannot necessarily answer a lot to your first question on the differences to older generations. Are the younger generations more pro-European? But what I can say is that there is still strong differences between young people, of course, also depending on where in Europe they're located. So the first thing I already said, like especially in Spain, in Italy, there is very strong support for the EU to step in on many policy areas and domains. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you see we had Denmark as one of the cases as well, where we put out the survey, and Denmark is really the outlier when it comes to support. So there was not so much appetite for engaging young people more. They are much more skeptic of the EU stepping in terms of providing social kind of help or housing, etc. Of course, that's a phenomena which is known also not only for the young generation. It just shows that what we know, especially on the Nordics, might also be true for the younger generations, which is that they tend to have already quite high standards, especially social standards. So their specific, let's say, quote unquote, Euroscepticism emerges more from maybe a fear of also losing that, or that these standards might be lowered, or also kind of saying we don't necessarily need the EU to come in and help us with that. We are already doing fairly well. So there's that difference for sure. And when it comes to Central Europe, especially France, Germany, what we saw on how much appetite there is for the EU to step in certain policy areas, it's usually in the middle. I mean, of course, there's differences according to the many questions we ask, but they're usually somewhere in the middle, let's say, in terms of enthusiasm. I mean, which always means that the majority usually is in supporting certain policies, but it's a bit lower than, for example, in Spain, Italy, or even Romania. Yeah.
Okay, so we still have basically like still some differences between like depending on when you are and how you are located. So I think this is also very interesting to point out, just like even if right now like there are some trends, but we still have like national borders are still very hard to cross, in certain area, especially on social issues. But for example, but how you build, progressive politics, with those with those three issues. Like as you said right now, like for example, like in Denmark or in Sweden, like they will tend to be more protective of the social system. Maybe like some of you do not know, but like those two countries actually were super reluctant for the EU to even have like common principles of the EU minimum wage, which was something like really like seen as a top priority for the Southern European, even if sometimes they were part of the same groups. So how you do build right now coalitions around progressive ideas if you have so many national differences?
Well, I guess that's the challenge for any political family, not only the Social Democrats. It's trying to find compromises which work for everybody, and yeah, but it's still what is clear is as long as you share the same principles, which for Social Democrats is based around solidarity, is based around kind of making a more equal and just and democratic society. If you share these principles, you'll always find a way while still catering to some of the national differences that exist, and it's fair enough that they exist, because although Europe grows together, there is of course these differences. So it's a matter of finding compromise based on the principles which are clearly shared within the progressive party family, I would say. And maybe one thing to add, which is interesting also from the lens of a progressive think tank, is that there is not only differences on how people or young people in the country think about some issues, but there's also big differences, for example, on what type of income you have. So one big thing we found is that, for example, we clustered our answers by those with a low income, high income, medium income, etc. So it's a typical thing done in polls. And what we found there is that those with the highest income are often far less inclined to kind of prioritize things like tackling inequality and poverty. Just to give you an example, around 40% of those with median income, low income, or no income said inequality and poverty should be a priority for the EU to be tackled in the next 5 years, and that number is 18% for that group of the highest income. So we don't only see that kind of differences between countries, but we also see these kind of classical differences between income groups, which of course, that is an issue, because of course those with a higher income are more likely to have more to share also in terms of taxes. So that's just maybe interesting to point out that this is also something which remains an issue in the younger generations, that you have these differences.
Okay, thanks. And just before like we go to the Q&A, I think we might have already some questions. It's just like how should we maybe like this is a bit like a fortune telling and maybe guessing, but how we can envisage like what young Europeans will vote next year, basically in 1 year. Should they vote like what can of what would be for the top priorities at the EU level, like besides like what you said on climate and inequalities, like how this should be converted into for the election? Do you think they will campaign for dedicated things? Do you think maybe like political parties will actually like try to implement like dedicated youth policies? Like how we should understand how the youth the vote of the young people under 35 like will act, because like it's going to be right now millennials and Gen Z is becoming like a bigger and bigger voting bloc in many countries. So it has an impact, and right now like people parties really want actually just maybe to get those votes if they want to be elected.
Yeah. First of all, indeed, political parties need to and should pay attention to these voting groups, because not only because they're getting bigger, also looking to the future. Of course, what we know from also kind of political science literature, usually political opinions are formed like in your 20s, let's say, or early 20s. So the earlier you can convince them of your message, the longer they're like likely to stick with you. So it's for now that it's important, of course, to campaign for young people and to get their vote, but it's also thinking the long-term perspective. It's important to not only look for short-term benefits, but also kind of see that those will remain your voters for a long time to come. And the earlier you kind of connect them to you, the more, the better it is. Now, of course, we here at the Political Foundation can and will not campaign, but what is important around the elections is, I think, the things I said. It will be jobs, it will be inequality, much more, of course, what we didn't capture yet in our survey, but which is a development since the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis. So these topics will matter. Housing will matter for sure. And then, what was your second question? Sorry, you had the issue campaigns. Indeed, this is something what also the literature says, that young people, which are known to not be as closely tied to, like, let's say, political parties as maybe the older generations, what is important, for example, is trying to reach them with also single issue campaigns related to certain topics which are related to or concern young people, for example, housing. So this is indeed maybe a promising strategy to get them also to vote in general for whomever they vote, but to get them to vote is really concentrate on some topics and try to, which matter to them. This is for sure maybe a promising strategy.
Okay, interesting. So I cannot wait to see like how like European parties and national parties will campaign for the elections. There is still a long way to go, and we still have a lot of elections for the Sphere countries in Spain, in Greece, in Poland. So of course, like right now, like national campaigns will remain important, but also interesting to see like how your ability, like some trends across the spectrum, like going to look in 1 year. So far, we think we have noticed to have two questions. So let me just like first say the first one. The first one is like, are we seeing big differences between young Europeans on the war against Ukraine?
Do we see big differences? Okay, so that was a separate study which I I put it into the camera early on. So again, we have to say we collected that data in April last year, so opinions might have changed, of course, a little bit. Big differences. First of all, I think what our survey showed is that at the time there was a massive support for EU support on many dimensions that concerns both the military dimension but also the humanitarian dimensions, and taking in refugees. There was big support for that. Big support meaning in the range of close to 70% of young people said that's a good idea, that you should support these type of measures. What we also saw is that young people are fairly worried that the war might spread to their country. So we're talking about 55 to 60% of young people, and maybe 25 to 30% saying, no, that's not likely. So a very high amount of young people at the time, of course, that's when the conflict was 2 months old, were fairly worried that there would be a spread. When it comes to asking for more support of the EU and also showing solidarity, what we could see is that especially in the neighboring countries, so in that particular survey we had only 6 countries, but especially in Poland and Romania, who had at the time a large influx of refugees coming across their borders, that there was the strongest support both in helping them, but also calls upon the EU to help more, because of course it's hard to deal as a national state only. And at the time, I would argue it was mainly the civil society doing it, trying to provide that support network. You can't do it alone. So there, the call for support was definitely strongest, I would say.
Okay, let me just also highlight that Sfera has published a lot of videos regarding the Ukraine war, and our Polish partner Krytyka Polityczne has been actually very good on they published a lot of interesting features about how difficult it is for Ukrainians to get housing in Poland, like the differences between how young Hungarians and young Polish, what are they, how the it seems like they have some. Not the same level of support regarding the war against Ukraine, as it can be like the political debates on those countries are very different, or how still like how challenging it can be like for young Ukrainians to even integrate, even if with the best efforts in Poland right now to find a job and so on, and how it can be a challenge to reconnect with their families. Also, a bit of a branding for us for Sfera. Like we are going to continue, of course, to cover like what's going to happen to Ukraine, and we are already planning our next video features, which should be out very soon. So stay tuned. And maybe like one of the last, the other questions that we have is just like okay, like this question is like do we see a lot of differences on the question of migration, especially between Eastern and Southern Europe? And did the war in Ukraine has also changed the view of young Europeans from Eastern Europe about harboring more refugees?
Right. So first of all, in our first survey, this was not made a big focus point of our at the time because it was the data was collected before Russia's attack on Ukraine. So it's hard to compare the two. What I can say we did ask that question in our Ukraine survey. Basically, there were two surveys. Would you like the EU to help refugees to come to your country from Ukraine? And the second one was, would you like the EU to provide more money to kind of help them integrate, provide jobs, etc.? The differences are the ones which I mentioned before. So Romania, Poland basically showed a lot of support for taking in refugees, but they also called for more money, EU money to kind of support them. Similarly, the EU, the UK was actually quite in favor also of providing more support. This is that's what I can say. And then beyond what was in the survey, is of course known, I think, to any reader of the media. I think that the support for Ukrainian refugees, especially in Poland, it was of a very different nature than it was for those arriving from other parts of the world. So I mean, this is well known. So there was that big outpour in Polish civil society, especially towards at the beginning of the war, towards taking people in even in their houses, and then that was a great show of solidarity. But I cannot provide like a big comparison to the previous studies here.
Yeah, I think this is an issue when we are like it's very hard to at the same time to have like very like focus like dedicated focus on different countries while at the same time having an equal view. Like this is one of the main challenge of working on European pollings. I think right now our time is almost up, and I think we have no more questions. But maybe let me ask you like, did I miss anything important that I should have asked you about? Like, did you think like based on the findings, like there are some stuff maybe we should also mention as important that we haven't really discussed?
I don't think there was any big lack of key points or something which we discussed. I think the important takeaways is those which I mentioned, that jobs, equality, climate are the things which really matter to young people. And this is also shown in our survey, and we will of course also continue our work on that, and probably also launch a new survey. We tend to do them every 3-4 years.
Okay.
Currently, we're actually focusing on a new project on more disadvantaged young people and how they participate in democracy, which also looking towards the European elections. That could be interesting for some of your viewers to kind of follow the FEP's website and social media channels to see when that's out. But apart from that, I don't think I have any more points.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matteo, for being here and for your patience.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for staying here. So we are going to continue to have one last live before taking a little break this spring. So thank you very much for being here. And of course, we are going to link like all the reports that SFEP have done on this survey of European millennials and Gen Z. And of course, we will send you like other relevant information that will be can be super interesting for young Europeans 1 year before the elections. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thanks for having me. Bye bye.
See you.